Tonight's event is co-hosted by Hennepin History Museum, the Minnesota Department of Transportation, and the Heritage Studies and Public History program at the University of Minnesota, which we'll abbreviate as HSPH. A Public History of 35W is a collaboration between members of the South Minneapolis community and students and faculty in the HSPH program. The freeway is something that's easy to overlook, or at least to take for granted. Maybe we don't think about it very critically as we drive along it from one place to another. And because it's such a big piece of infrastructure, it takes up an entire city block running down the length of Minneapolis. It's tempting to think it's always been there, but of course it wasn't always there. It was planned in the mid-1950s, construction began in 1962, and the stretch from 94 to Highway 62 in 1968. So we'd like to know, what was it like to lose a home or be forced to move out of the freeway's path? Where did those people go? How has 35W changed the neighborhoods of South Minneapolis? And how did the freeway affect Black, Indigenous, and people of color? And how were their experiences different from or similar to white residents of South Minneapolis? These are just some of our questions, and we don't have all the answers. In fact, we're going to need your help to answer these and other questions about 35W. Historical archives that include documents, old newspaper articles, they don't say much about how people on the street and in the neighborhoods of South Minneapolis experienced or continue to experience 35W. We're hoping some of you tuning in tonight will be willing to share your stories and perspectives with us. Our plan is to develop an online archive of oral histories and stories about 35W in South Minneapolis, and to open a public exhibition about our work at Hennepin History Museum in fall 2021, roughly a year from now. Between then and now, we'll be hosting other events for you to get involved and learn more about what we're finding. Tonight, you'll be hearing a series of short presentations, and rather than introduce each speaker, I'll ask that they introduce themselves. We've designed the agenda so that you'll hear a couple presentations, and then we'll take a break and hear questions and comments, and then we'll hear a few more presentations followed by additional discussion. You can ask a question or make a comment at any point, at any time, by writing in the chat window that Brynna told us about. The last comment I'll make is that tonight we'll be saying some things that are critical of transportation planners and engineers who worked for the Minnesota Department of Highways, the men who planned and built the original 35W. We're not talking about a successor, the Minnesota Department of Transportation, or MnDOT. Freeway planning and construction happens differently today than it did in the past. On hand to answer any questions you might have about the current 35W reconstruction project is Aaron Tagg and Eric Backstrom from MnDOT. So in just a moment, I'll turn it over to our first presenter, Dr. Ernest Lloyd. But before I do, I'd like to tell you that those of us working on a public history of 35W feel in our heads that this is important work and that it matters to people in the present. Dr. Ernest Lloyd makes us feel in our hearts that it's important, and I think of him as the soul of this project. So with that, I'll turn it over to Ernest.
Thank you, Greg. Appreciate that. Thanks, everybody, for coming tonight. My name is Ernest Lloyd. I've been in transportation for almost 40 years. I had a time down in Iowa. In this area, land management, we call right-of-way, homeland security, emergency management. I also worked in the civil rights area at MnDOT for so many years, and now I'm a team member of the Public History of 35W project. And I'm gonna begin by starting the voices from the past, still speaking to us today. This is an extension of my dissertation, and I'm looking at that time, how the routing of Interstate 35W impacted African-American middle-class community. There have been much written about over the country about maybe low-income impacted community, but very few about African-American middle-class community, especially that one in Minneapolis, in that area. In doing so, there was an area in my research study located by East 38th Street on the north, 42nd Street on the south, Nicollet Avenue on the west, and Portland on the east for census year 1940 through 1970 was identified at that time as census tract 100. You can see it on your screen there where a 35W going through in that minority neighborhood there. That's where the middle class was identified. To gain a broader understanding of how the interstate disrupted this community, I initially interviewed 7 prominent African Americans, whom I dubbed the elders, who told the story of how the routing of Interstate 35W impacted the African American middle class community in South Minneapolis. The trailblazers, I call them, the elders, represented those early African Americans who moved to Minneapolis in the 1940s and 50s during the Great Black Migration. So who are these people? They became the voice of the community. Let me tell you who they were. They were William Matt Little, you see him right there on your screen, Martin, Gaskin, Howard, Judy, Davis, and Richardson. Why are they called prominent? Because they helped me shape the narrative. And doing so, there were others that I interviewed, but these 7 stood out among others as leaders or elders in the community. And they helped me define and shape the middle class community in South Minneapolis. They were serving on NAACP for 22 years. Other one brought lawsuit against the Minneapolis Fire Department and won for not hiring African American. Another one was an activist, human rights, was a writer for 22 years in Minneapolis, wrote weekly series called Women's View, board of Summit Academy, board of the Human Rights Council. Another person was an inventor, entrepreneur, philanthropist, originated a Meals on Wheels program. Another person became the first African American hired by the Hennepin County Welfare Department, now called the Hennepin County Department of Social Services, in 1945. She also became the first African American to be appointed supervisor of that said department, became president of the National Council for Negro Women. Another one was first African American woman, a person in general, to be special assistant to the president of the University of Minnesota. Another person found the Urban Coalition in Minneapolis, served on the city council there for 22 years. Golden Glove boxing coach for the Olympics in 1984. And finally, another one was advertising director for Applebon Supermarket. Also became commissioner of the Minnesota Department of Human Rights. Some commonality of these people. Before 35W, it tells me it was a vibrant middle class neighborhood. They tell me that the good place to raise a family. They tell me that a good and safe place to live, to purchase your property, and to conduct business. A steadily increase in home ownership was there. Okay. During and after 35W, Did I miss a slide there? Let me go back to that one. Okay, right there, thank you. What else did the elder tell me? They said South Minneapolis was what? An integrated community. More home ownership was there. More college graduates lived there. South Minneapolis became the center of African American middle class. There were doctors, lawyers, engineers, school teachers, social workers, and railroad porters. They were part of the Minneapolis middle class community. Okay? So what happened during 35W? They tell me that because this massive freeway came through the neighborhood at that time, it caused demographic changes in the area. It heightened racial tension there between the whites and African American, split and divided community, and encouraged white flight. We got shortchanged for our homes, said one elder. They said also it limited crossing to get to the other side, crossing at 46 and 36. They tell me that because they felt boxed in by the red line that had been identified by the federal government. Okay. They tell me a 35W created a 6-block wide swath that merely solidified the red line to the west that already existed to denote how far west African American could purchase homes, rent, build businesses, and raise their family, just like anybody else would like to do. Thus, this boxed-in feeling is within the Census Tract 100 and harder to get to the other side, west of Nicollet. You can see that there. If you could just make your screen larger on your computer, you can see to the right there of that red line was identified by the government. It is the 35W project. Okay. What economy existed at that particular time? It split and divided that community. It's engaged unscrupulous, and I want to stress that, unscrupulous realtor. But on the other hand, it brought about economic opportunity for the surrounding area, but at a great cost to perhaps the physical health, to the ears, from the persistent pounding of power driving, to the lungs and to the eyes with the fume from the gas and diesel driven equipment bellowing up in the air and drifting over the community. One elder tells me that it was that pounding 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, the pounding. They said they can still hear it now, 35, 40 years later. Listen to our elders to promote equitable public policy. Although they were influential, and they were not able to provide access to major policy like 35W. They were not heard by the established white majority policymakers. They were not able to influence major public works projects, such as this massive 35W. There were no African American in the Minnesota legislature or the city council, and no African American mayor. So what do? Where do you go from here? African American community want to be heard and help policymakers, faith-based communities, schools, naturalists, and businesses fulfill the American dream of living in a safe and clean community. They have opportunities to prosper and never again be negatively impacted by inadequate highway design. And I would like to finish my presentation on this note. The live and dying experience of George Floyd tell us that in the 50 years since the building of 35W, we are still struggling with racial inequity in public policy and social justice. So what the elders are really saying to us in this day is to listen to the first verse of the Black National Anthem in order to create socially just policy and to avoid dismantling neighborhood. Lift every voice and sing to earth and heaven. Reign with the harmony of liberty. Thank you. That ends my presentation. There'll be some question and answer period following the next presenter.
Thanks so much, Ernest. That was fabulous. Next, we'll hear from Eric Hankin-Redmon.
Thanks, Greg. Can everyone hear me?
Perfectly.
Great. So I'm Eric Hankin-Redmon. I'm a recent graduate of the Heritage Studies and Public History program at the University of Minnesota. I worked with Greg, and I'm going to talk about alternative routes for 35W. And I should say that it's an abridged version of a much longer essay that I wrote that you can find on our website. So, why has it been put right there? This is the question that serves as a heading for a February 1957 Minneapolis Star article that sought to explain the decision-making process for building the interstate highway loop on the southern and western edges of downtown Minneapolis, which included I-35W in South Minneapolis. It's an apt question, as many city residents were in the dark about why the freeway ended up running 6 miles through the block between Stevens and 2nd Avenues. There were a few alternative routes for the freeway's so-called south leg, along with potential solutions for decongesting traffic on the city's south side. But this presentation focuses on the final two, between Stevens and 2nd Avenue, or Cedar Avenue, which was proposed by Hennepin and Dakota counties for various reasons. Cedar Avenue was favored by Minneapolis city engineer Hugo Erickson, but this route was because the Stevens second route originally had a complex interchange system downtown that would have fed traffic directly into a one-way street, causing chronic congestion. They call the interchange the Big Pretzel, quote unquote. But this route was eliminated by Chief Engineer L.P. Zimmerman because, in a nutshell, it was deemed inconvenient for Southwest suburbanites and would affect the leafy neighborhoods near Lake Nokomis. That left the Stevens second route as the final choice, though even that decision was fraught. The gentle curve you see in the current route began at about 25th Street and ending at Lake Street, and it's there to circumvent the Minneapolis Convention Center and the Minneapolis Institute of Art, both of which would have been destroyed if the original route had won out. Finally, all was set to go. However, when one examines maps highlighting neighborhoods where marginalized people lived, we begin to see why certain paths may have been chosen over others. In 1937, sociologist Calvin Schmidt wrote Social Saga of Two Cities, an ecological and statistical study of social trends in Minneapolis and St. Paul. In it, he includes several maps of who lived where in Minnesota's two largest cities. This particular map shows where African Americans lived throughout Minneapolis, underlaid with a map showing alternative routes using data from the 1930 census. One dot equals 5 people, and it's obvious that African Americans are concentrated in a few areas. The eventual route itself doesn't run directly through where African Americans were concentrated on the south side, but it does go through the communities in which they lived. In the 1930s, the Homeowners Loan Company, HOLC, created color-coded maps that showed which areas of a city were safe enough to invest. There were 4 grades: A, green for best, B, blue for still desirable, C, yellow for definitely declining, and D, red for hazardous. The hazardous red category tended to be inhabited predominantly by African Americans and other quote-unquote infiltrating groups, such as Italians and Eastern Europeans. As you look at this, note the yellow and red on the west side of the old south side. This was a predominantly black section of the neighborhood. The eventual route of 35W from the south city limits to northeast Minneapolis almost exclusively weaves its way through red and yellow areas. Besides affecting blacks, the freeway's route also affected lower income households writ large, making its construction a class issue too. And so, freeways may be commonplace, but there are always complicated politics at hand when deciding what goes where. Thank you.
Greg, muted.
Thank you. We'll take a few questions that have been posed in the chat, and Sophie Hunt will read a couple of them. And Sophie, let's do this for about 5 minutes so that we can perhaps catch back up on our screen.
Sure. Yeah, and I'm public programs manager at Hennepin History Museum, so I've been interacting with many of you on social media, and it's good to see your names on the participant list. So before I ask the question, I just want to mention, some of the comments that have been coming up on the chat about people who remember this time. There were someone who said her parents bought a house along 35W in 1960 as they were digging the trench. Another person who was asking about similarities to crosstown highways. And so I think it's so great that we have so many people here who have things to share, and I hope that you can connect with the team later. The question that came up that was directed to Ernest. So Ernest, I'll let you start, but I think that Greg, you've written an essay on this, so you may also want to chime in. A question about how African-American homeowners were reimbursed for the taking of their home. And the questioner went on to say, do we know how the values were appraised and how that compared to their actual estimated worth? So Ernest, do you want to start us off with what you
Have Greg start us off on that.
Okay, we'll let Greg start.
Well, I'll try to be brief here. It's very interesting. So for 35W in South Minneapolis, the Highway Department used condemnation, which was a court-ordered process that essentially forced people to give up their homes, and a court determined the value of the home. Now, somebody listening was interested in the crosstown. This process of condemnation was deeply unpopular with the community, particularly homeowners who lost their home. And so after most of the property was acquired for 35W, the Highway Department switched to what they called direct buying, which is essentially they would contact the homeowner and negotiate a price for their house based on appraisal. And that began with the crosstown. Now, we are hopeful that we are going to gain access to some files at the Department of Transportation, which maintains a file for every property that was taken for 35W. It includes the original appraisal and some correspondence. And In a presentation to follow in just a few minutes, my colleague Jessica Carter and Jacob Noble will explain a database that we're building of hopefully everybody who is displaced by the freeway. And when we match that database to records that we hope to gain access to at the Department of Transportation, we'll be able to see how homes were appraised and potentially how they may have been appraised differently for Black homeowners versus white homeowners. This has never been done anywhere in the country before, trying to track individual people displaced by a freeway. So we think it's really important and we're excited to do it. And access to these files has been difficult because of COVID, but we're hopeful we'll be able to do it.
And I'll ask one more question. And Ernest, I'm going to say you only have, to stick with Greg's timeline, you have about a minute and a half to answer me here. But it was something I thought about when you started your presentation, which is just how important your research, the oral histories that you did were. Yes. What a tremendous treasure this is, because a lot of those people are not with us anymore. And so I wondered if you just had a thing or two to say about what it was like to track down those people and to talk to those people.
It was invigorating, to be honest with you, to talk to these trailblazers, the elders, these people who endure a lot of discrimination, but yet they continue to move forward and push forward because they want to make a difference in their society. They want to better themselves at the same time, better those around them. And they had positive attitudes. And they kept smiles on their faces. It just sends chills to me to this very day when I talk about them, because they are, like you said, they all are gone, but yet I can still hear their voices speaking to me about how they felt just by being discriminated against in housing in particularly, and in employment, and being the first African-American person to be in a department of hundreds and hundreds of people. Stood out like a sore thumb, but they kept smiling, they kept strong, they kept pushing forward to make a fundamental difference in Minneapolis and Minnesota as a whole. It was wonderful.
Thank you. Greg, I'll hand it back to you.
Wow, thank you, Ernest. Next, we'll hear from Bruce Bruemmer, who we've talked so far about the displacement of people. Bruce will be talking about displaced property. Take it away, Bruce.
Well, I'm Bruce Bruemmer. I retired last year as archivist for Cargill for 19 years or so. And one of the things in retirement is you get to pick what you want to do. And I figured I wanted to be on the other side of the reference desk for a while and have other people bring boxes to me rather than the usual way of me bringing them to other people. And I was looking around for historical issues, and I kept hearing about Rondo every year, about Interstate 94, which I've lived 10 miles from for most of my life, down in Chicago for a little bit. And it piqued my interest. I started a little bit of research, went to the Historical Society, started some research in a database, went to a meeting last fall, and then found out that there was a whole Hennepin History Museum, University of Minnesota, MnDOT team working on exactly the same questions I had. So I said, well, forget that. I'm looking for something else. But a member of the team refound me this spring, and now I'm focused on a database that I initially started and is nearly half done, relating to the property. Let's move to the photo. This I found, it was a highway department photo at the Minnesota Historical Society. It was a house that was moved from 4725 Stevens. It actually was moved within the city to, and if you want to know, 4137 4th Avenue South, it is still there. And I look at this photo and I'm just awestruck that any houses could be moved in mass like that. You can't see the cross streets, but that's Nicollet. that they're on. And it just raised all sorts of questions for me. What does it mean when you start moving and wrecking 2 blocks in a relatively straight line? Did some owners stay with their homes? Did they purchase their homes and move them somewhere else? Were most of the homes wrecked? Who did the wrecking? How old were the homes in total? And probably the most important question, how many of these things actually? It's just awesome when I think about that. So I decided to do an inventory. How hard could that be? Found a simple program. Started with city directories, and I simply went down Stevens on the odd side and Second Avenue on the even side. I was most interested in from lake to the city limits and focused on that. But the real nice source was something that I knew about, but what became even better when I started working with it. These are the scanned city permit cards for each address in the city of Minneapolis going up to about 1974. And they're not perfect. It's not absolutely good data, but it's really great. And the wonderful part about this is that every house that was wrecked, not necessarily just because of the freeway, but when the house was wrecked, they put this nice red stamp on there that says wrecking on it. It also included information on when the dwelling was built, when it was moved or wrecked, where it was moved to, if it was within the city, because they wanted to cross-index that, and if it was moved outside the city limits. And sometimes they actually said where, but not the address. So I inventoried everything from Lake Street to the city limits. I had some assumptions, but what did I find? And if you go to the pie chart, this represents the 825 dwellings that I could determine that were displaced, mostly on Stevens and Second. And this is the distribution. The shocker was the number of dwellings moved. If you take the green and the blue, the green being moved outside the city, the blue moved within Minneapolis, it is almost half and half with those are wrecked. So I was not expecting that at all. And as we get into this, it seems like the house movers seem to be the main key for understanding what went on. We still haven't gotten to the point where we can say how many houses were moved with owners. That's forthcoming. But it appears not many. It seems like the house movers were critical to purchasing the properties and moving them where they could, and sort of being the broker between new sellers and the properties themselves. Wrecking was dominated by about 3 firms, some of which are still around. Newer housing stock was more attractive. That shouldn't surprise anybody. And so as you got closer to Richfield, where the houses were actually built in the 30s, some actually in the 1950s, those tended to be picked up by the movers. The other killer surprise for me was just the fact that so many houses got moved outside the city. Sadly, those aren't noted on the permit list. We don't exactly know what addresses they are, and the moving permits really weren't saved except for those permit cards. So we're going to have to do some digging. Now, I don't consider myself a data person. I do find this work kind of Zen-like. But I also find that data can be a pretty compelling storyteller just by itself. And sometimes the data actually communicates itself when you just map it. So if we go to the next picture, this is a picture of all the addresses that I found of houses that were moved from the freeway to other places within Minneapolis. That blue portion in the pie chart that you saw, this is where they ended up. I know you can't see precisely where things are, but you do get a sense of the distribution. I just find this very fascinating. And during a pandemic, I can't engage with people. I actually did try to. I saw somebody at one of the houses that I knew was moved, and I got off my bicycle and tried to talk to them. And then as I rode away, decided that was a really stupid way to proceed because there's a pandemic going on. But when you start taking some basic information and plotting it in this compelling way, it really starts to tell a picture. You can go back to the individual house permits, and some of these are sad stories. A house that got moved out of harm's way and then went over to Hiawatha and then was wrecked when they did work on improving Hiawatha. So what's next for the database? Greg mentioned the MnDOT records. There are pictures available for every house that we think that existed before it was either moved or wrecked. I definitely want those to add to the database. We're certainly going to finish the data to downtown, go north of Lake. That's a must. And as well as making this searchable for anybody who's interested in the data. But I have to say, in conclusion, that we really depend on all the information that people can bring to bear. It's striking to me as an archivist, and I've known this all my career, that it takes such a short time for information to disappear. And this is a great time to reflect on the cost of what putting the highway in. And it wasn't always all bad, but we did pay a tremendous price. And more importantly, how can all this information be gone within one lifetime? It is threadbare. You saw on the slide with Dr. Lloyd the list of elders, and they're all listed as late. This history is going away, and for us to understand what actually happened really relies on our listeners today to come up and help us with the sources and get those oral histories and get those 8mm films in somebody's hands so the next generation can learn from that. Thanks very much.
Thanks so much, Bruce. That's amazing research. I'm just astounded by what you're finding. Next up, we'll hear from Jessica Carter and Jacob Noble. While Bruce has been tracking displaced property, Jessica and Jacob are beginning to track displaced people. Take it away.
Okay, hi everyone. Like Greg said, my name is Jessica Carter, and I'll be a second-year student in the Public History and Heritage Study program at the university. And so I just kind of want to go over what we've been doing recently. So mainly the goal of a public history of 35W is to understand the freeway from a community perspective. And what it would be like to be displaced by this kind of construction, to live adjacent to it, to be displaced, and how has it changed the neighborhood in the last 50 years. And most especially what we wanted to know is how has it impacted Black, Indigenous, and people of color? And how was that different or similar from white residents? So we know that the freeway's construction required the highway department to condemn or purchase nearly 1,000 properties in South Minneapolis, and most of them were residential apartments and single-family homes. But what we don't know is exactly how many people were displaced. So determining who most directly affected by the freeway's construction and how they were affected, that's a really important part of our project. So how can we find them? And how can we find out what we need to know, or what do we do once we identify them? So I'm going to take you on a little journey of how we've started to find them. So first, we started with a map that the Minnesota Department of Transportation had. And what it does, it's on the slide right here. So it's over 7 feet long, and it shows the right-of-way and the path it carved through South Minneapolis and the neighborhoods that each presenter has been talking about. And on the margins, if you can tell, there are names of every property owner, like on this slide. So that's a good start that we had, but we didn't know how to find addresses and demographic information. So next, we turned to the 1958 city directories, and that gives head of households. So if you can see on the slide here, we've got a couple head of households from 2nd Avenue South to Stevens Avenue. So this is right in the path of the freeway. And older directories in cities like Minneapolis, they were formatted in 2 ways. So one of them would be the names and addresses were listed alphabetically. And the second way is that addresses were listed sequentially down each street, and it shows who lived in house block by block. So we use the second format to examine who lived on these street numbers on the numbered side of 2nd Avenue South and odd numbered on the side of Stevens Avenue. So once we found the name and the address, we entered it into our database, which will be on the slide here. So where do we go from here? So on the picture, you can see we've got the name, we've got the address. Now what do we do? So we turn to the census information, and specifically 1930 and 1940 census have been really helpful just because they're closest in time to when the freeway was happening. So we turn to these records to find demographic information. Like many of you have put in the chat, race was a big one, occupation, birth date, spouse, if they had family members, or if we can find any surviving descendants, if they owned their home, and if they did own it or rent it, how much was it valued at and how much did they rent for? So census records that are older than 72 years old are fully available for the public examination, meaning that when we find individual people as opposed to more recent census records, we can examine the demographic patterns, but not individual people. So all of this kind of process, sorry, I took it really quickly. It comes with some challenges. So the process is a little bit more complicated and time consuming than one might imagine. And some challenges that are present when searching for properties like this that are no longer there include the considerable gap between when we can find them in the last census, which is 1940, that's available, and when freeway construction was happening, which is 1957. So people were forced to move in around 1957, and when we can locate them in the census, there's about a 20-year gap. And so issues can arise when that individual might have moved in between to a different state or a different part of the city. They could have passed also. So issues like that, it becomes challenging. So another challenge of searching for people in the census is confusion with common names. And since the search parameters are really broad and grow quite considerably when there is no specific address or we can't find one in a directory, the number of possible people that come up in the census broadens quite a bit, and sometimes it becomes difficult to pinpoint an exact person. And then another challenge is city directories are a really important source and have been for this database of the project. But as you saw in one of the past photographs, they only include the head of household. So, which these don't enable us to see every person in the household. So, which would be necessary to determine the total number of people that were displaced by the entire freeway. So that's a quick and not so simple process of how we've been finding people that were displaced. So now I'm going to turn it over to Jacob to kind of take you through what do we do now. Thanks, guys.
Thank you, Jessica. My second year of the HSPH program in the fall. And so I want to talk a little bit about some of the things that we've been questions we've had to ourselves as we're doing this research. Specifically, who are the people who are affected by this, and where did these people go once they were displaced? This ties into some research that I've been doing recently about what we've been calling freeway families. You can see these are both classified ads from the Minneapolis Star Tribune from the 60s. I think these are both from 1960. But these were ads that appeared all over the classifieds for a couple years of families either looking for homes themselves after their home had been either moved or destroyed because of the freeway, or having real estate firms look for those homes on their behalf. And so another next step that we want to look at is broadening our search of directories to ones that include the city and the suburbs up to 1965 to help better search for people after they were displaced. Jessica's doing this really great work finding people before they were displaced. And we want to try and look at those people and where they ended up after that displacement happened. And we generally know that people of color, due to the racism in real estate and lending practices, like redlining and racial covenants, like we've heard talked about earlier tonight, tended to have fewer options of where they could move. So we've been trying to look for where we can see maybe these disparities show up in these records, where we can find them. Another thing I want to talk about is kind of why this history is important, why people should care about it. I think it's really important to understand that this is an important part of Minneapolis's history, but it's also an important part of the United States history more generally. This same pattern happened in cities all over the country, places like Detroit or Flint, or just anywhere in the US, you can find cities like stories like this. And more specifically to Minneapolis, it has one of the highest rates of racial disparity in home ownership between Black and white residents anywhere in the county. And so this isn't natural, and it didn't just happen. And we think that one of the reasons it happened is because of freeway construction. And I think most importantly, to touch on, racial justice and equity are things that should be important for everyone, no matter who you are or where you live. And so we hope that just by helping shine a light on this, we can help show the ways that can be important and the ways you can learn about it. Now, one of the great things, I've been looking at the chat, and a lot of you have been like offering suggestions or asking about ways you can contribute or help. And we're really interested to have that public help, which is why we're hoping to make the database and any maps we develop out of this public and accessible, so that you can look for those and find maybe your own family or people that you knew, or maybe a home that you knew, the home that you grew up in that was moved. And we also are probably going to need help building this database out. If people are interested in volunteering, you can certainly reach out to us and we can find ways for you to help with that. And lastly, we want to think about where this research is going to lead us. We've mentioned, of course, this public database and public maps, but also we're hoping to open an exhibit at the Hennepin History Museum in the summer of 2021. Obviously, knock on wood, COVID not being a factor by then. And then just on a more granular level, immediate level, we want to learn more about the people who were displaced by 35W and where they ended up, kind of how their lives were changed or disrupted because of this freeway construction. So I really hope that you'll consider, following up on those questions and talking to us more, so you can help us learn more about this from your perspective. And I think now we're turning it over to Tyler.
Thanks, Jacob. And yes, Tyler, you're up next, but before you begin, let me say that we will conclude the program, to be respectful of everyone's time, at 7:30. However, we will stay online for at least another 10 minutes after 7:30 to take additional questions. So Tyler, take it away.
Thanks. Yeah, hi, I'm Tyler McDaniel. I am a recent graduate of the Heritage Studies and Public History program, and have been on this project since about last May. And I also work with Rethos in the Rural Programs Division. So I'm going to talk a little bit today about some of the environmental impacts that resulted from the construction of 35W and through to the present. And we are by no means going to be comprehensive, so you're going to kind of get the greatest hits here. And hopefully as we move forward, we can find and start to dissect some raw data to see how these things are impacting the present in a more accurate way. So first off, we are going to talk about just traffic and air quality. And there's a quote up here in the corner from Mrs. Gerald Seward, Paul Pioneer Press in 1971. And the air in the morning when all the cars are going to work, it's like exhaust right in your own room. You lie upstairs and you think of your children and their poor little lungs. What is happening to them? So in some of the press around this time, there were a lot of comments from folks about air. Also thinking about in this time when cars still ran on leaded gasoline, and some of these comments talk about seeing smog rising up over the banks of the freeway and being able to smell it as you're inside of your home, and then just a general air quality and thicker air around a freeway. And considering some of the effects of air pollution that places like the Center for Disease Control have listed, people who live in areas where there are higher rates of auto emissions and air pollution are at higher risk for asthma. They have generally decreased lung function, making it harder to breathe, and they're at higher rate for cardiovascular disorders like heart disease and hypertension, and children are subject to birth defects. And like I mentioned earlier with the lead pollution, you kind of see this most prevalently in the Phillips neighborhood, nearly boxed in by 3 different roads, and in the 1980s had some of the highest rates of soil lead contamination in the United States, with one person in the city of Minneapolis calling it a silent epidemic in the Phillips neighborhood. So alongside air quality and air pollution at the time, there was the issue of noise pollution. And I know that, people often don't think about noise pollution as a big issue, but that is, noise pollution. People would make mention of complaining that they couldn't hear their neighbors talking to one another, that they couldn't keep their windows open, they couldn't relax outside. So neighborhood residents started to organize, and they, wrote to their city council members, kept pressure on, did their own independent research. The city of Minneapolis did a study in 1971 where they studied noise decibel levels along the freeway. And what this study said was that normal human conversation happens around 60 decibels, and anything over 80 decibels starts to contribute to annoyance and hearing loss. And the study measured the decibel rate around 77 on average during the day, that would rise to 85 and 90 decibels during peak traffic hours. And at nighttime, it would drop a little bit to 69 decibels, but would then rise anywhere from 16 to 20 when you would have traffic going by. And also considering at this time, traffic was much louder. Vehicles were much louder. So the city began to also research remediation efforts for this. So they tried to do different types of paving with blacktop to absorb the noise, which was found to be mostly ineffective. So this led to the noise walls that you see now like lining 35W. And these helped a little bit, or they helped significantly for folks facing the freeway, though people a little further away from the freeway said that there wasn't really a change in the noise that they heard. But since then, various studies by the World Health Organization and other independent studies have shown that constant exposure to these high rates of noise pollution can lead to increased rates of blood pressure, hypertension. They can disrupt sleep, which also contributes to those things, and also cognitive impairments in children. There was actually a study done in New York City in the 70s related to train noise going through an area, and they found that that students on the side of the school where the train was had lower test scores than students on the side where the train was not. And they then did noise dampening measures, and within 1 year, the students' test scores had leveled out throughout the school with the noise remediation efforts. So another issue for this was that at the time, the Environmental Protection Agency in the early 70s had designated noise hazard, and because of that, housing and urban development wouldn't loans if you live in an area that suffered from extreme noise pollution. So because of this, a lot of homes in Minneapolis were able to get insurance on their home mortgage loans. And then, of course, that plays into other issues about, redlining and housing access and access to loans and things like that. So to conclude this very quick crash course in environmental concerns, we got to think about questions, who is impacted most by these things, both historically and presently? What are the long-term public health consequences of the freeway? And how can we curb the effects for residents along the freeway? And I think one way to do that, which I sort of skipped over in an effort to keep up with time, is doing remediation through planting trees and other greenery and improving the greenscape and green infrastructure along these big projects, because trees absorb carbon monoxide and or carbon dioxide rather, and put out oxygen, and they've also been shown to decrease urban heat island effects. So trees are a really great way to sort of curb some of these effects across multiple areas of air pollution and noise pollution, and even other weather events like torrential downpours that might be made worse by not having anything to absorb them and just by having to run off of concrete surfaces. And then also considering the fact of like who's using the freeway versus who lives in the neighborhoods along the freeway. And is it the people in the neighborhoods who are using the freeway, or is it a suburban tool or a tool that people in other parts of the cities are using to get through? And hopefully we can uncover a little bit more of that information as far as the rates of people that use public transit and car ownership in certain neighborhoods, who might not be using the freeway but are affected by those that are. So thank you for listening to my quick crash course.
Thanks so much, Tyler. Now, as promised a moment ago, to be respectful of everyone's time, we will formally conclude the program here. And I'd like to thank Hennepin History Museum and the Minnesota Department of Transportation for hosting this event with us. But for those of you who have time and interest, we will stay online and take some of the questions that you've posed in the chat. Sophie, can you triage our questions and come up with a few? Sophie, are you there?
I forgot to turn on my microphone. Sorry.
There you are.
So yeah, here I am. So once again, there have been so many good comments and questions on the chat, and I know, Greg, you've been kind of taking them one by one as they come. But I thought I would start just going back to Bruce with the data that you've collected about wrecking and moving homes. And there were a number of questions right in a row, and Greg responded to them individually, but I think they all add up to kind of a collective surprise that was the same as what we had, that so many houses were moved. And so people were puzzling through, they were asking us how this compares to moving houses in other cities, whether we know anything about whether homeowners had the option to have their houses moved. Do we know yet if it breaks down by race? And we don't know that yet. But I just wondered, I know you've done so much thinking about this. Do you want to comment about your thoughts about which houses were moved and which were wrecked and what the logic was there?
Well, really, I'm just at the stunned stage still at this point. It makes sense from a seller's point of view. So I am suspecting that the house movers there were more out there than I realized looking at the Star Tribune. And also there must have been about 20 different businesses that moved these houses. So there was something going on there, but I don't think it was part of it was any relationship with the owners before they were moved. And I think they were just sort of matchmakers. And that's something we really want to investigate. Whether this is any different from what went on elsewhere in the interstate system, I have no idea. We're just looking at the data that were presented, and we'll go with that. Greg, you may have something to comment, since that's been what your research has been pointed to recently.
Yeah, we don't have any evidence to indicate that homeowners had an option to move their own houses. It would be interesting if we find that evidence, but the way the process worked out of property condemnation, I don't see any opportunity where an owner could have planned that and implemented that. And Bruce is right that it appears though that the house wreckers and movers took the lead in determining which houses were moved and to where. Somebody asked a really interesting question in the chat about do we know if houses owned by Black homeowners were moved less or more than houses moved by white homeowners? We don't know yet, but when we're able to combine Bruce's database with the database that Jessica and Jacob talked about, if we can get access to files at the Department of Transportation, we may be able to make that type of assessment. So we're hopeful, and it would be really interesting.
Great, thanks. Next question, we'll start with the historians and then move on to maybe giving our guests from MnDOT a chance to speak as well. So the question is, what type of legal framework existed at the initial planning and construction to protect residents and homeowners' rights? And then what has happened since then with these protections? So we'll start with the historians.
Well, I've written about this one too, so maybe I'll start briefly. Homeowners didn't really have any legal rights or protection. The Interstate Highway Act of 1956, which essentially laid out the rules and procedures for how freeways would be built in the country, required only one public meeting for each project. So this is hard to imagine, but it's true that there was one public meeting in the city of Minneapolis for 94 and one public meeting for 35W. That was the only opportunity for people to voice comments about the freeway. And about 16 people spoke at the 35W public hearing, 2 of whom were women. It's just astounding to me still. However, people, once the route was picked, people lost their homes. And as I said before, the process was through eminent domain. They got a letter in the mail saying that their house was being condemned and that they should appear in court. They were asked to appear in court twice, and then they were told how much money they'd be offered. That's literally how the process worked. They could appeal an offer if they felt it was too low, but many felt that they had to hire a lawyer. They'd have to hire their own appraisal. They were not reimbursed for legal fees or appraisal fees. And you're going up against the state of Minnesota. How do you ever expect to win when the state has its own team of lawyers and appraisers on its staff? But I would like things are handled differently today. And so perhaps Aaron and Eric could say more about that from DOT.
Yeah, hi, this is Aaron. And so there's 2 really important laws that were passed in the early 1970s that really changed how everything was done. One of those is the National Environmental Protection Act, also known as NEPA, that really lays out the process and the protections for communities as large projects are done around the country, both transportation projects as well as other projects. And then the other important one was the Uniform Relocation Assistance and Real Property Acquisition Act in 1970. And that laid out how property is acquired today. And there's a lot more protections for people, a lot more protections for renters. I think back when the interstates were first built, there really weren't any relocation assistance. And so now even renters get assistance as well as property owners when properties are acquired.
Thanks. Next question has to do with the method of doing history. I'll count on a historian to want to talk more about your method. I find it so interesting that you've talked a little bit about oral histories. We started with Ernest Lloyd's oral histories, and I know you're collecting oral histories now. We've also talked about collecting data and archival work. It's interesting the way the two things complement each other. And so the question is actually bringing it back to Ernest, to where we started. So there are two parts to the question, Ernest. First of all, a question about whether the elders that you talked to said anything about moving homes or having their homes moved. And the second part of the question is, someone in the chat was remembering as Tyler was talking about environmental impacts, that was something that the elders told you about, the noise of the freeway. And so I just wonder what you have to say about those two things, what the elders said about moving homes and also what they said about the noise during construction and after.
Thank you. They were telling me that, one, they had no choice in the process. Home all around them got moved. Nobody knew where they were going. Be destroyed or moved to another location, to the budding suburbs or what have you. They had no idea where they were going, because it's almost like being trapped in a revolving door, if you will. The door never have an end to it. That's how they viewed this entire process of 35W. It was this massive maze of uncertainties and unforgiveness on the part of the policymakers and the engineers to want to do two things: to move the project along from point A to point B, which is the overarching policy of the 1956 Act, was to build a highway. Doesn't matter what happened. No matter who we're going to move to, no matter who we're going to destroy property, if you will. It was this uncertainty that exists, according to the elders.
Thanks. I wonder if anyone else just wants to add to the general question about the importance of oral history. It's where we ended. It's where Jacob ended, talking about ways the community can help. But of course, we're asking for the community's help in this big data collection project that we're doing. But there are also so many people who have shared in the chat just really vivid memories that they have or that their parents told them about this time. So I wonder if you want to say anything generally, researchers, about what is it that you can gain from talking to people who lived through this or have heard family stories about this time?
Denise, I wonder if you could chime in.
Yeah. Hi, we're really interested in speaking with people who have personal experience with the freeway. We've been doing some oral history interviews and we're trying to reach out and find people, but we're always looking for more. If you visit our website, you can fill out a contact form and we can get in touch with you. You can also email us at the email that's up on the screen. But this is so important because these personal stories really put the human value on what was lost to the freeway. And so we would really love to talk to anyone who has any personal memories. Did you play in the freeway dirt while it was being constructed? Did your family lose a home? What was it like? What businesses were lost? What was it like before and after the freeway? Anything and everything is important. So please don't hesitate to reach out if you have any personal memories or stories related.
Thanks. Greg, I think that might be a really good place to end it and tie things up.
Thanks, Sophie. There are many more questions you've asked, and they're all interesting to us. I hope, as Sophie and Denise said, that you'll reach out to us through our website or through this email address. And what I would say in conclusion, that this is really complex history. And probably every one of us who is on this presentation tonight and all of the participants are in a way complicit in it. I mean, I drive on 35W. I use it to get from point to point. And this project is in part a way to think really critically about who benefits and who has paid the costs for this type of infrastructure, because it's not just about the past. This isn't just history. It still affects people today, and people who have been affected by it throughout history are many of them still alive, and their families are alive. So we thank you a lot for tuning in to us and hearing what we've had to say, and thank you for your questions, and thank you again for Hennepin History Museum and the Department of Transportation for helping us host this event. It's been great, and thank you so much.